Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to welcome to the show Nathan Thrall. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Day in the Life of Abid Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. Also spent a decade at the International Crisis Group, where he was the director of the Arab-Israeli Project. Nathan, thanks for being on, and congratulations on the success of the book. I know it came out a little while ago, but you're doing more press now, and thanks for being on to talk about it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Sure. So first of all, tell us a little bit about, before the book, your work as director of the Arab-Israeli Project.
Yeah. So I worked for an NGO called the International Crisis Group. They work in, at the time I was there, about 65 different conflict zones all over the world. And the idea of the organization is really to give an on-the-ground sense of what's happening in a given place. And they do that with lots and lots of interviews with everyone from a low-level militia member to a prime minister or an advisor to a prime minister. And so it's really very similar to long-form journalism, but heavily footnoted. And so my work there was about writing detailed reports on Israel-Palestine, on wars in Gaza, on the siege of Gaza, on Palestinian politics, on Israeli politics. And those were designed primarily, they're publicly available, but they were designed primarily for experts. They were designed for policymakers, particularly in Western governments. And really, it was a big break for me in 2020 when I left and I decided I was going to do a totally different kind of writing, which was to do narrative. And the reason that I did that actually is because I found that I was wasting my time talking to the experts. And I had so many conversations with these experts where they said privately, I agree with you. I agree the situation isn't changing. I agree it's a situation of permanent subjugation. I agree that my Western government is helping prop it up. And so long as that's the case, this thing's never going to end. But I'm not going to do anything about it. And here's why. Because I'm going to risk my job. I'm going to potentially risk my career. At the very least, we're talking about weeks or months of headache for me, for the tiniest little change that you, Nathan, would laugh at. And you would dismiss as so insignificant. So I'm just not going to bother. And what I realized is I'm talking to the wrong people. I'm writing for the wrong people. We need to have a different understanding, a different public conversation of the situation in Israel-Palestine to enable those policymakers and politicians to start to act on what they privately believe.
You've lived in Israel now with your family for more than a decade, and you're still there. What do you want before? And we'll talk about the book, of course. What do you want to see change? Like, you're still there. You haven't left the country. You've not turned your back on it and say, I can't stay here. You're still trying to effectuate change. And what is that change you want?
It's a very, very long-term view that I have. I do not believe that we're going to see anything resembling justice or equality in my lifetime. I think that what I am here to do is to try and move the ball forward a tiny bit. I have a very long-term optimism, but in the short run, in the medium term, I think we're just miles and miles away from seeing the kind of change we'd need.
And what fuels your desire for justice and equality?
Well, I'm an American, and I have some basic understanding of what a democracy ought to be, and what exists there isn't a democracy. It's, a single state, a single sovereign, the state of Israel, that rules from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea over 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians. And the vast majority of those Palestinians don't have basic civil rights. And the kind of conversation that we have here is totally detached from that reality. It's a conversation about Israel as a democracy with a temporary occupation. And there's nothing temporary about this occupation. 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live in the occupied territories. When they vote, they're voting from their settlements, and they're not casting absentee ballots. And these settlements are totally integrated into the state of Israel. They have been de facto annexed. And what we see is a steady process of Israeli expansion, Palestinians being constricted into smaller and smaller spaces, and Israeli Jewish settlements expanding. So it is the opposite of equality. It's the opposite of justice. What I'm really witnessing is something akin to what was happening to the Native Americans. Um, and we're all standing by as our government supporting it.
Yes, I'm talking with Nathan Thrall. So let's talk about your book, because again, it also gives a jumping off point to what's going on right now in the Middle East, the day in the life of Abid Salama. The bus crash in 2012, where 6 Palestinian children are killed in a bus accident. And can you share, why did you use this bus accident as a jumping off point to share the Salama family story, but also the story about Palestinians in the West Bank?
So the first thing is, this particular story moved me deeply. These are people who share a city with me, but live on the other side of a 26-foot tall gray concrete wall. They're surrounded by walls. They live in an entirely enclosed a ghetto, and they have a radically different life than me, just a couple miles away on the other side of this wall. And for me, the story of this bus accident was emblematic of the entire situation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left in a state of deliberate and utter neglect. But there were other reasons that I really wanted to tell the story of this bus accident. And one of them is that, what I wanted to do was to draw our attention to the everyday reality, to the system that exists that keeps Israeli Jews dominating Palestinian life. And too often, we are paying attention to Israel-Palestine when there's a war in Gaza, when there's some
Uh-huh.
tremendous bloodshed. And when that happens, you often hear politicians saying, we need to restore calm. We need to get back to the situation as it existed before this bloodshed. And I wanted to show what that calm really looks like. It's anything but calm for Palestinians. It is a life that is filled with tragedy. There are daily tragedies happening in this place, even when there's not a war in Gaza. And I wanted to draw our attention to that. And the way to do that, I felt, was to tell the story of something that a journalist wouldn't normally devote a book to, something as commonplace as a car accident, and to show how very differently a car accident plays out in this situation on an Israeli controlled road in the West Bank, with a group of Palestinian kindergartners on a school bus, with a first Israeli fire truck arriving at the scene more than half an hour after this bus catches fire and flips over.
And what is the point that, I've read the book, so I get it, but what is the point that you want to make to people about, you just mentioned the fire truck, like a half hour later, even though it was very close to a checkpoint and close to a settlement that had fire brigades that could have helped. Instead, it took Palestinian ambulances to navigate a very difficult road to get there, a difficult way going through their own checkpoints. What is the point of that for the reader?
You know, there's been a lot of writing in recent years about whether or not Israel is practicing apartheid. And that's not an analogy to South Africa. That's a
Hmm.
legal concept. There's an
Right.
international convention against apartheid. It's in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And it's a system of domination by one group over another group with the intention of maintaining that system. That's the definition. And those reports have found, these are the leading human rights organizations in the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN Human Rights Council, leading Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. And it's also even very senior Israeli officials, like the former director of the Mossad said Israel is practicing apartheid. The former attorney general, the highest legal authority in Israel, said Israel is practicing apartheid. And yet, that hadn't really trickled down, that understanding, to ordinary people. And I felt that one of the objectives of this book was, through the story of this accident, to put you in the shoes of a few people, including a father trying to
Mhm.
find his son who is on this bus, and to watch as they navigate, to be in their shoes as they navigate through this system, that you would actually come away with a much deeper understanding of what this system of apartheid actually looks like, feels like, how it works. So that was really one of the main goals, was not just to tell a story that would punch you in the gut and show you how much tragedy there is for all of the people living under the system, but also to understand how the system actually works.
And it's a beautifully written book. I mean, you got a Pulitzer Prize, and for the research and the time you put into it, and the beauty in which the prose, and just it's very vivid.
Thank
I
you.
was just rereading a part today where the driver of the bus comes to out of the coma and realizes it has no legs and has a heart attack, and then lose the ability to speak. And those little details stay with you. It's very haunting. And you're
Yeah,
speaking to the father about his lost son, Malad, and those they stay with you. That's it's a haunting book in its own way, even though it's not a depressing book. There's a lot of life in it. Another line that jumped out at me, and it's more to the politics of it, that over the decades, demography and the geography of the occupied territories were transformed by various Israeli administrations, which used a range of policies to Judaize them. What does that mean so people understand that?
well, there is a place called Palestine, and there has been a decades-long project of transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. And part of that project has been the expulsion of Palestinians. It has been the razing of villages. It has been the renaming of Palestinian villages with Israeli names. And so all of that is a project of Judaization. And this is a phrase that the Israeli government itself uses, and not just in the occupied territories. This is a phrase that it used, for example, in the Galilee, when it had a project of expanding Israeli Jewish presence and constricting Palestinians. This is within Israel, within its pre-67 borders, and they called it Judaizing the Galilee. And so that's what it is. It's about taking land from Palestinians and making it Jewish land.
And when we look at the administration now with Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, and people in this administration who are far right, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, is there a sense that, from that point of view and that far right point of view, that there's a supremacy involved, that people who are of other faiths, Christian or Muslim, are inherently inferior, the same way supremacists by race in America would look at people of color?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is, and the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, speaks in exactly those terms. It talks about Jewish supremacy and a regime of Jewish supremacy. And it's important to note that although the people that you just mentioned, those far-right politicians, are the most kind of blunt in
Mm-hmm.
expressing their support for that supremacy, the regime itself is a reflection of that supremacy, and that supremacy exists whether or not you have a right-wing government in Israel. And so often we have this kind of superficial focus on what outrageous racist thing some far-right minister said, when we really should be focused on the regime of supremacy that existed under all of these Israeli governments. I mean, since the occupation began in 1967, every Israeli government, left, right, and center, has pursued the project of expanding Israeli Jewish settlements and constricting Palestinians into tighter and tighter places. And so, all the time here in the West, we're talking about Netanyahu this, Netanyahu that. Will Netanyahu survive? It doesn't matter. He can go tomorrow, and it's going to be the same regime of supremacy that's going to be in place. And that's what we need to focus on.
Interesting. When you think about it that way, and it's discussions that I've had with people within my own community. My late dad would say he liked it when the right wing prime ministers got elected in Israel, because then you couldn't deny what they were about. It was more the Labor Party ones who sounded nice and liberal on things that put a gloss over it, and made people go like, "Oh, you see that." But during both administrations, they expanded settlements from 67 and from 93 from Oslo. Oslo contemplated a Palestinian state in the West Bank, and the settlement construction since then has just advanced more and more. And just since in the last year in the West Bank, and I was just reading about it, and I'd love you to speak to it a little bit. There's been more land confiscation by the Israeli government in the West Bank, not Gaza, in the West Bank, than there's been since 1993 when Oslo Accord contemplated a Palestinian state there, that this administration is just taking land left and right under the cover of while the world's looking at Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say a couple of things. First, I know so many people who think like your dad, so many Palestinians, and also people on the Israeli left who think like your dad did. That it's actually useful for the masks to come off and for people to see this for what it is. Um, what I would say about Oslo and land confiscation is, first of all, really important to note that Oslo did not say that there would be a Palestinian state. What they talked about was Palestinian autonomy, and Palestinians wanted to believe that that would mean a state for them. But Israel was very careful not to say that they were going to allow a Palestinian state. And in fact, the prime minister who was overseeing Oslo, Yitzhak Rabin, in his final major speech to the Knesset about Oslo, putting it through, he was very explicit. He said, what I'm talking about at the end of this process is less than a state. I'm talking about Israel keeping all of the territory that it annexed in Jerusalem. I'm talking about an Israeli presence in the Jordan Valley, meaning that we're going to be in this entity, which is not a state, indefinitely. So the other thing to say is you noted that this year has seen a major acceleration in the process of Israeli expansion. Israel has taken more land in the West Bank in the last year than in the previous 20 years combined. Now, the most important thing that we need to understand about that is that this process that's been in place since 1967, it's accelerating. It's in overdrive right now, and we're sitting by while our government is supporting it.
Yes, I know that very well. And it's these, and what they've supported in Gaza is indefensible on any level, moral, legal, philosophical. What we've seen in Gaza are things that it's like images out of World War One that I cannot believe could happen in our time. And while I'm on this earth as an adult watching it play out in real time, and it's happened.
Yeah.
And we see this play out, and there's no limit to it. I mean, that's what concerns me. So when with the settlements, I mean, and I've shared this on my show before. I mean, my grandmother's land was taken by settlers and turned into a settlement a long time ago. But right now, my cousins who live outside of Bethlehem have nice property, and the settlers are there now, and it's a UNESCO site. It's right on by the Green Line, and they want their property now. And this is ongoing. And with this administration, with Netanyahu, if the settlers came and took it, I think the Israeli military would protect them. I mean, literally came on their property. It's a standoff right now. And, I fear for my family and for others who live in that area that there's no end to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. You're right to fear for them because that's the process that's in place. It's expansion. It's Israeli Jewish expansion and Palestinian constriction into smaller and smaller enclaves. And if we just project out, if we just look at how this has gone historically since 1967, and we chart it on a line, we make a graph, you project outward, and it looks like the fate of the Palestinians is going to be like that of the Native Americans, unless we see a radical change here in the US.
So it has to be. So when you look at the Middle East, and specifically Israeli policy, then it's clear that you're putting a lot of weight and significance to how the American government addresses it.
1,000%.
Right. So as we see younger people have a different view of this conflict, it'll take time for the leadership to be elected that reflects that. And it's not easy because, you mentioned earlier something where someone said, well, I could talk about this issue like an elected official or a politician, but it's going to cause me a lot of blowback and pushback. And that's true. I used to always say there's no upside for politicians to stand up for Palestinians' humanity, but things have changed now a little bit in that public opinion among younger people see this conflict vastly different. And it's so interesting to hear older people go like, well, they don't know the history. I go, but they don't need to know the history to see what's going on in Gaza and going, that's our weapons doing that. And if Palestinians were doing that to Israelis and we were funding the Palestinians, these young people would be saying the exact same thing. It's like,
Yes.
this is wrong. We should not be doing that. So
Yeah.
I'm hopeful if it becomes more of a political issue. And you've talked about that there's really people have shared with you, there's no really room for a two-state solution in terms of a true sovereign Palestinian contiguous state.
Yeah.
So what would you like to see? Like, what are you working towards?
I tend to avoid the discussion about these future scenarios,
Hmm.
one state, two state confederation, because I find that those conversations are often used as a tool to distract
Hmm.
from the reality on the ground. And so it's very comfortable for a lot of people to say, well, the occupation's temporary. We don't really need to think about what's happening today. We don't need to think about Israeli soldiers coming every night and taking adolescents from their homes and arresting them for throwing stones at occupying tanks or writing anti-occupation graffiti. We don't need to focus on that. Let's focus on the really important thing, which is the permanent. The permanent is coming. The permanent is going to be two states or one state. This can't go on. It's unsustainable, right? It's inevitable that Israel is going to have to choose either to give Palestinians sovereignty on the one hand or equality and citizenship on the other. They can't just keep doing this forever, but they've been doing it for 57 years, and they absolutely can keep doing it so long as the US government provides this major shield. UN Security Council vetoes, weapons, all kinds of diplomatic and political support. Israel relies on it. In Gaza, they couldn't wage this war without US weapons, and they were
Hmm.
asking for US resupply in the first weeks of the war. The US could have ended this war with a snap of a finger. And so I share your optimism about this younger generation, that when they come into power in 2 decades, things can be different. But we also have to do everything that we can to try and change things now. And so to answer your question about two states and one state and what I'm really going for, I don't care what form it takes, 7 states, 10 states, 12 states. It needs to be based on full equality.
Very much so. And to your point about we could have ended this war, I had on a few times recently Harrison Mann. He was a U.S. major. Resigned from the military, and he was in intelligence. And he resigned because he's Jewish. And he said, I can't be a part of this. And that his family taught him never again. And he meant to him, it meant never to anyone. And he came on the show since he gave his resignation in November. He's out since June, and said, if we just didn't rearm Israel, the war would have ended. Like, it could have ended that way
Yep.
in Gaza at any time, because
Yes.
they would not have the armament they needed to do it, even from other sources. Just not would have been. He said airplane parts. It's our airplanes. They can't
Yes.
get them from other places. So to your point, yes, that's absolutely true. The war could have ended. And right now we've got, and I know it's not the West Bank or Israel proper, but Netanyahu just earlier this week said to the people of Lebanon, if you don't rise up and get rid of Hezbollah, I'm going to turn Lebanon into Gaza. Which, if
Yeah.
any other world leader said that, we'd be building a coalition to stop that person, calling them a madman and saying they're like Putin. But
Yeah.
what Netanyahu says, we have an administration that goes, well, we're talking to them, and not saying that's outrageous, where they
A-
should be saying that's outrageous.
Absolutely. What kind of message is it sending to um, Arab Americans? The way that the U.S. is supporting Israel in this war in Lebanon now. I mean, you want they're wondering, why is there so many Arab Americans who are upset with them, and Michigan might be in play. Well, here's your answer right here.
Very much so. Again, the book, Nathan, it was great meeting you again. The book, Day in the Life of Abid Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy, is a Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's a great read. And, I so appreciate your activism and what you're doing to bring attention to this issue. And, I have a similar goal. I don't know two state. I used to all talk about two state forever. At this point, I just want a just peace
Yeah.
where both Palestinian and Israeli mothers don't have to fear that when their children leave, that they'll be killed by a missile or a militant, that they can both dream of a brighter future. And I don't know how we get there at this point. I'm open to any suggestion that'll bring us to that end. So
Yeah.
two state, three state, one state where people who just want to fight, you put them in there, let them fight, and the other people want peace. whatever it is at
Mhm.
this point, I agree with you.
Yeah.
That's what we're working for.
Yeah. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks a lot, Nathan. Great work.
Thank
And I
you.
look for, hopefully we'll chat again in the future as things develop. I'd love to have you on to talk about what's going on the ground when you're back in Israel.
I'd love that.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.